Exactly at 12 a.m., while I was standing pressed behind the second-floor curtain of my neighbor's house, the back door of my home opened. My daughter-in-law stepped out first, her hands trembling as she clutched a thick stack of papers. Behind her was a man I had never seen before, tall, wearing a dark coat, carrying an old leather briefcase. They didn't exchange money. They exchanged documents. Then the two of them quietly walked toward the shed where my husband had worked for 30 years. My heart began to race because they thought I was hundreds of miles away. But the truth was, I had never left this town. And in that moment, I understood. They weren't just betraying me. They were preparing to erase me from my own life. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. I had to grip the windowsill just to stay upright. My knees were shaking, not from the cold, but from a raw, primal fear rising from deep in my stomach. In the dim light spilling from the back porch, I could see Natalie's walk clearly. I had watched that walk for 8 years, since the day she entered my home in a pure white wedding dress, holding my son's hand. I knew every small movement she made, and I knew that when Natalie walked that slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clenched tight against her chest, she was doing something she didn't want anyone to see. The man walking behind her sent a chill through me. Not because he looked dangerous. On the contrary, he looked completely ordinary. Too ordinary. Tall, thin, gray-haired, wearing a dark coat that was old but clean, and a leather briefcase worn at the handle, the kind I used to see carried by lawyers or bank employees back in the 1990s. That ordinariness was what terrified me, because it said one thing clearly. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't reckless. This was something carefully prepared. They stopped in front of the shed. That shed. God. My heart tightened when I saw that old wooden door. My husband, Harold, had built it with his own hands. For 30 years, every weekend he was in there, fixing the lawnmower, building wooden shelves, making small things for neighbors. It was where he escaped the world, where he turned on AM radio to listen to the morning news and drank strong black coffee. When Harold died, I kept the shed locked for almost a year. I couldn't bear to step inside it alone. And now Natalie was using that very place to meet a strange man at midnight with stacks of documents in her hands. I turned away and leaned my back against the cold wall of Howard's living room. Howard Klein, the neighbor who had lived across from me for more than 20 years. If it hadn't been for him, I don't know what would have happened to me that night. It was Howard who had told me in a low, unusually serious voice, "Lorraine, if you want the truth, you have to see it with your own eyes. Some things can't be explained." And he was right. Before standing here, trembling behind the curtain like a thief, I had still been trying to convince myself that maybe I was overthinking things, that maybe old age had made me more sensitive, that maybe Ethan and Natalie were just going through a difficult phase, and I, like so many other mothers, was exaggerating everything in my head. But the feeling that my home was no longer safe had been clinging to me for weeks. It didn't come from one big event, but from very small things. Things that, if I described them, people might laugh and say I was paranoid. But I had lived 63 years. I knew when a house began to change the way it breathed. Before, I woke up every morning at 6 a.m. I made coffee in an old glass pot, one Harold had bought years ago at Sears. Ethan usually came into the kitchen a few minutes after me, hair still messy, smiling and saying, "Morning, Mom." Natalie came down later, usually after 7 a.m., neat, lightly scented with perfume. We used to have quiet but comfortable breakfasts. Then everything changed. Ethan started coming down later. Some mornings I didn't see him until I had already finished cleaning up. Natalie began whispering to Ethan in the living room. Every time I walked in, the conversation stopped immediately. Ethan looked down at his phone. Natalie smiled, a smile so stiff it felt like a mask. I started noticing my son's eyes. He no longer looked straight at me the way he used to. He avoided my gaze, as if he were afraid I might read something there. And then there was the room, my old bedroom with Harold. After he passed, I had cleared it out, leaving only a few memory boxes and a wooden cabinet. That room had always been open, until one day I realized the door was locked. At first I said nothing. I just stood there, my hand resting on the cold lock. A new lock, not the old one. "Oh, that room?" Natalie said when I asked. "We locked it because it's damp, Mom. We didn't want your things getting moldy." Her voice was too quick, too smooth, as if she had practiced the answer. I nodded, but inside, a cold stone dropped. Then there were the nights I heard noises, not loud, not clear. Just soft footsteps, a door opening and closing. Some nights I heard the faint sound of a suitcase rolling across the wooden floor. When I stepped into the hallway, everything was silent, as if nothing had happened. I began to wonder if I was imagining things. That was why the idea of pretending to visit my sister came to me. It made me feel both ashamed and relieved. I hated lying to my son, but I hated even more the feeling of being pushed aside, treated like someone no longer clear-headed enough to understand what was happening in her own home. I told Ethan and Natalie I was going to Spokane to visit my sister for 1 week. I kept my voice casual. I even joked that I needed a change of scenery. Their reaction made my heart tighten. Ethan looked up too quickly. His eyes lit up for a split second. Then he caught himself. Natalie smiled. A wide, bright smile, far bigger than necessary. "That's wonderful, Mom," Natalie said. "You should take a little rest." Ethan nodded again and again. "Yeah, Mom. We'll take care of everything here." The way he said everything kept me awake all night. I packed my suitcase in front of them. I called my sister right there in the living room. I let them hear me talk about bus times, about how long I'd stay. I played the role of a slightly scatterbrained old mother so well that even I felt uncomfortable. Ethan insisted on driving me to the bus station. He wanted to be sure I left. I let him drive me. I hugged him. I looked into my son's eyes, the eyes I had looked into since the day he was born, and I saw no guilt, only urgency. I didn't get on the bus. I waited until Ethan left, then took a taxi back. Howard was already waiting. He didn't ask many questions. He just opened the door, led me upstairs, and pulled the curtain closed. "You need to see," he said again. And now I was seeing. Natalie and the man had gone into the shed. The door closed. A dim light turned on inside, shining through the dusty window. I saw shadows moving. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw Natalie hand the stack of papers to the man. He flipped through each page, nodding slowly. That wasn't the scene of a cash exchange. That was the scene of an agreement. A naked fear squeezed my chest. Not fear of losing money, not fear of being used, but something deeper, darker. The fear of being erased, decided for, treated like a burden that needed to be handled. Howard stood behind me in silence. I knew he was seeing the same thing I was. The first night I watched my own house gave me my answer, and it was more horrifying than anything I had imagined. I stood there long after the light in the shed went out completely. Howard gently touched my shoulder, reminding me that I was still breathing, still standing in his quiet living room, not trapped in a nightmare. I nodded, pulled the curtain closed, and sat down in the old armchair. My hands were ice cold, but my mind was burning. Dozens of questions flooded in, none fully answered. I knew only one thing. What I had just seen could not be separated from my past, from that house, from the life I had spent decades building. Harold and I met when we were very young. I was just in my early 20s, working part-time at a small-town library. Harold was an electrician, always smelling faintly of metal and machine oil. He didn't talk much, but every word was solid. We weren't rich, we never were, but we knew we were building something lasting. When we bought the land, it was just an empty lot, patchy grass, wind blowing straight through. Harold held my hand, pointed ahead, and said, "This will be our home." The house was built little by little. There were summers when we lived in a half-finished place, eating dinner at a temporary wooden table, surrounded by the smell of paint and insects. I remember every detail. The staircase Harold built himself, the third step that creaked slightly, the living room window frame set a bit crooked because it rained hard that day, the back porch where we drank tea every afternoon. 40 years passed, and that house became more than shelter. It was a witness to every stage of my life, from giving birth to Ethan, sleepless nights holding a baby, to quiet evenings when my husband and I had grown used to silence. When Harold died, it felt as if the house lost its voice. He was gone after a stroke, so fast I had no time to prepare. One morning, he was in the shed fixing an old radio. By evening, he was gone. I lived in that house like a shadow for almost 2 years. I didn't clean the shed. I didn't touch his clothes in the closet. I just moved through familiar rooms, trying not to touch the empty spaces. It was during that time that Ethan began staying over more often. At first, a few nights a week. Then gradually, he said he and Natalie wanted to move in with me. Ethan said I shouldn't live alone anymore. Natalie said the house was big enough that 3 people would make it warmer. I remember that night clearly, sitting across from me at the dining table, warm yellow light overhead, voices soft and caring. I looked at my son and saw the boy I once walked to school, the child I sheltered from rain. I didn't think of calculation. I had one simple thought: family should be together. At first, it truly was peaceful. Natalie woke up early to make breakfast. She always asked what I wanted to eat or drink. Sometimes she baked apple pie and placed it in front of me, saying it was her mother's recipe, but she wanted me to try it first. Ethan fixed the fence, replaced light bulbs, painted the north wall Harold had planned to do but never finished. When I spoke about my husband, Ethan listened closely. Natalie nodded, placed her hand over mine in shared sympathy. I believed them, completely. Some evenings, the 3 of us sat watching television, talking about nothing important. I told Natalie old stories about the house, every corner, every memory. She listened, asked questions, remembered. I felt relieved thinking the house wouldn't be abandoned, that it still had laughter and warmth. I even thought maybe this was how Harold stayed with me, through our son and his small family. But the warmth slowly changed, so gradually I didn't notice at first. There were no arguments, no harsh words, just tiny shifts. Natalie started rearranging things without asking. Familiar items were moved. Once I couldn't find the wooden box Harold made for me. Natalie said she'd put it in storage to keep the house tidy. I nodded but felt a quiet loss. Ethan was home less in the evenings. He said work was busy. When he was home, he sat on his phone replying quickly, then putting it away when I walked in. I didn't ask. I thought I should respect his privacy. Natalie stayed gentle, but her smile was no longer natural. She cared for me in a very proper, very correct way. So correct that sometimes I felt less like a mother and more like someone being managed. I still believed, because I didn't want to think otherwise. That may have been my greatest mistake. I didn't realize that, little by little, I was being pushed to the edge of my own home. No one said it outright. No one told me to stay out of the way or be quiet. But small decisions were made without me. Conversations happened when I wasn't there. Doors closed softly behind my back. I had opened the first door to all of this with trust, a mother's trust, that her child would never harm her. That care was genuine, not a disguise. Sitting in Howard's living room that night, I saw it clearly. That 40-year-old house wasn't just being used for something I didn't understand. It had become the stage for a play where I, the true owner, had been written out of the leading role long ago. After that night, I could no longer go back to being someone who didn't know, even though I still didn't see the whole picture. I sat quietly in Howard's living room, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock, like a borrowed heartbeat. Outside, the night wind moved through bare maple trees, brushing against the glass. I told myself to stay calm, that what I'd seen might only be part of something. But the more I tried to reassure myself, the more I remembered the small signs that had been there all along, like tiny cracks in a glass cup I had pretended not to see. I remembered the first time conversation stopped when I appeared. It was a Sunday afternoon, light rain falling, the kind that covers a town in gray mist. I had just come back from church, still holding the service program. When I walked into the living room, I heard Ethan and Natalie talking. Low voices, urgent. I caught only a few scattered words like paperwork, an appointment, and then silence. Natalie turned, smiling far too brightly, asking if I wanted tea. Ethan bent down to tie his shoes, as if he'd dropped something. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling like I'd stepped into a room everyone wanted to lock before I entered. After that, the pattern repeated. I stepped into the kitchen. Whispers vanished. I walked into the hallway. The topic changed to weather or food. What frightened me wasn't the silence, but the coordination, as if they'd practiced, as if there was an unspoken rule. When Mom's here, don't talk. The phone, too. I wasn't the type to snoop. I even found it a little funny how younger people glued themselves to screens. But Ethan, he was my son. I knew his breathing, his expressions when he was worried, happy, or hiding something. Some mornings, he sat at the breakfast table scrolling fast. When I walked in, he flipped the screen down or shoved it into his pocket, reflexively. If it were work, he wouldn't need to hide it. If it were personal, he wouldn't react. Like that. That hurried motion looked like someone caught doing something wrong. I asked casually once, keeping my voice light. "Is something going on, Ethan?" He looked at me, smiled faintly, said, "Nothing, Mom. Just small stuff." But his eyes wouldn't settle. He looked past me, down at the table, out the window, anywhere but at my face. That avoidance kept me awake at night. I had given birth to him, held him through fevers, watched him learn to walk and write. I knew how clear those eyes once were, and now they looked at me like I was an inconvenience, like I was in the way, not a mother. And then, the storage room. My old bedroom with Harold, the room I'd turned into a place for memories, suddenly became forbidden. The door wasn't just closed, it was locked. A new lock, shiny and cold under my fingers. I remember the feel of that metal, like touching an invisible boundary that had just been built inside my own home. When I asked, Natalie answered too quickly, "That room's damp, Mom. I was worried your boxes might get moldy." The explanation sounded reasonable on paper, but words, no matter how polished, still have a smell. With Natalie, it smelled like haste. She wasn't speaking like someone concerned. She was blocking a door. I tried to be reasonable. I told myself maybe the room really was damp. Maybe I'd overlooked something, but the more I thought, the less sense it made. I had lived in that house for 40 years. I knew which corners were damp, which stayed dry. I knew where the winter wind came from. I even remembered replacing the double pane windows last year to prevent condensation. And most of all, if they truly cared about my things, they would have talked to me first, asked what I wanted. They had no right to lock part of my house, let alone change the lock. Once at noon, when Natalie was out shopping, I tried opening the door with my keys. None fit. I stood there, listening to the useless clinking, then let my hand fall. My heart pounded, not with anger, but with the quiet realization of being stripped of authority. As if no one needed to hit you or yell, changing a lock was enough to say, "You're no longer in charge here." The nights that followed became a stretch of nights when I slept without truly sleeping. I lay in my room with the bedside lamp dimly lit, listening to the sounds of the house the way people listen to breaking news. There was the soft creak of the wooden floor in the hallway, the sound of a door opening and then closing. Some nights, close to 11 p.m., I heard a very distinct sound, the rolling of suitcase wheels across the floor, very light, as if someone deliberately lifted it whenever they passed over a spot that might creak. I sat upright, my heart pounding, listening. Part of me wanted to step out immediately, turn on the lights and confront them. But another part, the part that had lived long enough to understand how cruel people can become when they are cornered, held me back. I was afraid I would step out and be met with that look of pity, the kind people reserve for an old woman who imagines things. I was afraid Natalie would smile gently and say, "You must have heard wrong, Mom." I was afraid Ethan would sigh as if I were bothering them, and most frightening of all, I was afraid they would know I was paying attention. So I stayed still. I blamed myself. I scolded myself for becoming suspicious because of my age, for reading too many stories online about ugly family situations. I told myself that the suitcase sound was probably just Natalie rearranging things, that the footsteps were probably Ethan going to the kitchen for water, but every time I tried to explain it away, a very clear feeling surfaced, one I could not silence. A mother's instinct. That instinct doesn't speak in words. It feels like a stone sitting in your stomach, cold and heavy. It makes you look at a smile and sense something beneath it. It makes you hear the words, "I'm fine," and know with certainty that things are not fine. With Ethan, I had felt that instinct when he was a child. Just hearing his breathing was enough for me to know he was about to get a fever. I trusted that instinct more than any doctor's words, and now that instinct was screaming that something was seriously wrong. I began to observe every detail carefully, but I did it the way a woman does who has learned that silence can be a form of survival. I stopped questioning. I stopped asking, "What are you two talking about?" I simply listened and remembered. I started noticing what time Ethan came home. I noticed when Natalie muted her phone. I noticed the days they seemed especially eager to send me to bed early. I even noticed the smell in the house, the frequent presence of new cleaning products, as if they were trying to erase traces of something. Some mornings I saw the outdoor trash bin much fuller than usual, as if a large amount of paper had been thrown away. Other days I watched Natalie carry a large bag out to the garage, walking quickly, her shoulders tense. I heard the rustling sound of paper envelopes. I didn't know what was inside, but I knew one thing. Important things were being moved, stored away, hidden. I began to feel like I was living in my own home as a guest. No one told me to leave. No one said anything cruel. But each small sign, the conversations cut short, the disappearing phone, the avoiding eyes, the new lock, the suitcase sounds at night, was enough to slowly kill my trust. Trust doesn't collapse from a single blow. It dies from hundreds of needle pricks. And when trust dies, the truth becomes sharp as a blade. Tonight, after seeing Natalie meet a strange man with documents in the shed, all those small fragments suddenly fit together into a picture I didn't want to see. I didn't dare say it out loud because even admitting it made my throat tighten. I looked out the window once, more, even though I knew the light was off, even though I knew I would see only darkness and still trees. Howard stood beside me, his voice low. "You see now, Lorraine. You weren't imagining it." I nodded slightly, because from that moment on, I understood I had crossed a line. I was no longer just a mother hoping for peace in old age. I had become a woman who had to protect herself, with wide open eyes, a sharp memory, and a cold patience I never thought I possessed. I didn't take my eyes off my house for the rest of that night. After the light in the shed finally went out, Natalie returned to the house through the back door, her steps quicker than when she left, as if she wanted to erase her own tracks. The door closed very softly, almost without a sound. Then everything sank into silence. Silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I thought it might have been a one-time thing, that somehow, in a way I didn't yet understand, it would end there. But my instinct, the same instinct that had robbed me of sleep for weeks, would not allow that hope. I stayed there behind the thin curtain, waiting, like a night watchman guarding my own home. And then I saw them. Close to 10 p.m. the next night, a gray sedan pulled up in front of my house. The headlights turned off immediately. 2 people stepped out, a young woman and a man in his 40s. They didn't speak loudly. The woman pulled a medium-sized suitcase, its wheels rolling over the stone walkway. The man wore a backpack, the straps pulled tight across his chest. I recognized that kind of luggage immediately, not for a short dinner visit, but for an overnight stay. Natalie opened the door before they even rang the bell. That sight made my stomach tighten, not because it was unexpected, but because of how smoothly it happened. No hesitation, no questions. Natalie smiled, tilted her head, greeting them like a host accustomed to guests. They exchanged a few brief words. I couldn't hear them, but I saw the gesture clearly. The man pulled out his wallet, took out a few neatly folded bills, and placed them in Natalie's hand. She didn't count them. She simply nodded and stepped aside, signaling them to enter. Cash. In that moment, all doubt inside me turned into something heavy and undeniable. This wasn't paperwork. It wasn't a personal connection. It wasn't a casual visit. It was cash. And Natalie accepted it with a practiced motion. Howard stood beside me, breathing quietly. I didn't turn to look at him, but I knew he was seeing the same thing. The suitcase was pulled into the house. The door closed. The living room curtain shifted slightly, then went still. A while later, I saw the light come on in the upstairs hallway. Then the light from the locked room inside the house, not the shed, the room that had once been my bedroom. I covered my mouth with my hand, not because I was about to cry, but because if I didn't, I was afraid I might scream. I had lived in that room for nearly 30 years. I knew how the light spilled from the window when the lamp was on. I knew the position of the fixture, the angle of its glow. There was no mistaking it. Strangers had been led into the room I no longer had a key to. The room that held the last things Harold left me. The room I believed I was protecting by never entering it again. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I returned home before Ethan and Natalie woke up. Howard offered to come with me, but I shook my head. I needed to feel the house with my own body. I needed to see what everything looked like when daylight erased the shadows of the night before. Everything was perfect. The living room was tidy. The kitchen was spotless. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drifted through the air. Natalie stood by the stove, her hair neatly tied back, wearing a light-colored sweater. She turned and smiled at me gently, just like every other day. "Good morning, Mom. Did you sleep well?" The question made my throat go dry. I nodded and answered in a voice that surprised even me with how calm it sounded. Ethan came down the stairs, adjusting his sleeves, greeting me as if nothing had happened. No sign of unease, no tension, nothing at all. The strangers were gone. No suitcase, no backpack, no noise. The locked room sat silent, as if no one had ever stepped inside. I sat at the table, took a sip of coffee, felt the familiar bitterness spread across my tongue, and realized a cold truth. They were very good. So good that if I hadn't seen the night before with my own eyes, I would have believed everything was my imagination. Ethan talked about his work for the day. Natalie asked if I needed anything from the grocery store. They played their roles perfectly, frighteningly so. I looked at my son, the child I once believed could never lie, and understood this. They weren't hiding just one thing from me. They were living two lives under the same roof. I went back to Howard's house that night, and that night I saw them again. This time it was a different couple, a younger man with a large backpack and a blonde woman pulling a small suitcase. Natalie greeted them at the back door. Again, cash. Again, the nod. Again, the locked room. The nights that followed blurred together into an endless chain. Strangers arrived. Luggage went inside. Money changed hands. Lights turned on and off. And every morning, everything returned to normal with chilling perfection. Ethan remained the dutiful son, asking if I wanted him to fix the loose stair step. Natalie remained the attentive daughter-in-law, folding towels, wiping counters, asking about my health. I understood they were acting, and I understood that if I shattered that performance now, I would be the one who lost. Confront them? I had thought about it, many times. There were moments watching Natalie take the money when I wanted to run out of Howard's house, cross the street, pound on the door and ask, "What are you doing in my home?" But I stopped myself, not because I was weak, but because I was clear-headed enough to understand the danger. If I confronted them without proof, they would deny everything. They would say I heard wrong, saw wrong. They would use soft voices and concerned looks to turn me into a delusional old woman. And if what they were doing was bigger than what I had seen, if behind those rented rooms there was something more, then revealing my suspicion could make them change their plan, or worse, speed it up. I needed evidence. Not one piece, not one night, but a chain that couldn't be denied. I needed to know how long they had been doing this, how many people were involved, and how they were using my house. I needed to understand the entire play before pulling back the curtain. And so, I chose silence. Silence wasn't weakness. Silence was strategy. I began memorizing times, memorizing faces, memorizing car colors, suitcase sizes, the way strangers walked. I remembered how Natalie always took the money with her left hand. I remembered that Ethan was never present when the money changed hands, but always appeared calm the next morning. Every sleepless night brought me closer to the truth. I was no longer a woman sitting in the kitchen waiting for her children's care. I became an observer, quiet, patient. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, but I also knew one thing: that 40-year-old house, my life, and the honor of my late husband could not be sold off in silence, and I would not allow it. I stood by Howard's window long after the last car left that night. Streetlights cast a dull yellow glow onto the wet pavement. My house, seen from across the street, looked brutally peaceful. Howard pulled a chair closer and placed a cup of hot tea in front of me. He didn't speak right away. Neither did I. Some truths need to be spoken slowly, or they knock you to the ground. After a while, Howard finally spoke. His voice was rough and slow, as if each word had been carefully weighed. "Lorraine, I've actually been noticing this for weeks." I turned to him. The warm light in the living room made Howard look older than usual. The wrinkles around his eyes seemed deeper, not from age, but from worry held in too long. I wasn't surprised to hear him say that. I just wasn't ready for how clear the truth had become. Howard said that at first he thought he was just too idle, a widower living alone, spending more time at the window than necessary. He noticed cars parking in front of my house at night, then brushed it off. Probably friends of the kids, he thought, or someone stopping by late. But the cars kept coming, always after 9 p.m., often around 10 p.m., sometimes later. What made him suspicious was the pattern. Never during the day, never loud laughter or bright lights like normal gatherings. Everything was quiet, discreet, as if someone didn't want to be seen. And the people stepping out of the cars were never the same. Howard said he remembered clearly. Some nights it was a young couple pulling 2 large suitcases. Other nights it was a middle-aged man with a backpack. Sometimes 2 women speaking in accents that didn't sound local. But no matter who they were, they all had one thing in common: luggage. Always luggage. Not small handbags, not gifts, but what people bring when they plan to stay overnight. "I started wondering," Howard said slowly, "why people would come to your house at that hour with luggage like that and then disappear by morning." He looked at me, as if checking that I was still listening. I nodded, my throat burning. I had seen it myself, but hearing someone else confirm it still felt like a hammer striking my head. Howard admitted there were many nights he had stood exactly where I was standing now, looking through the curtain, watching Natalie open the door before guests even rang, watching her smile and usher them in, watching suitcases roll up the path, watching the door close quickly. "Your daughter-in-law," he said without malice, only truth, was always the one greeting them. I never saw Ethan do it. That matched everything I had observed. Natalie was the one in control. Natalie set the rhythm. Ethan stayed in the background. That division of roles sent a chill through me. It showed this wasn't impulsive, it was intentional. Howard said he had wrestled with himself for weeks. He didn't want to interfere in someone else's family. He was afraid of being seen as idle or suspicious. "You know," he said softly, "at our age, it's easy to be labeled as imagining things. I didn't want to worry you unless I was sure." I understood that better than anyone. I had labeled myself that way just to keep living in false peace. But then one night, Howard paused, took a sip of tea, as if steadying himself. He said that night was colder than usual. He was awake with insomnia, and he saw something that erased all doubt. Natalie opened the door, as usual. A man stepped in, pulling a suitcase. But before going inside, the man stopped and pulled out his wallet. Howard saw clearly because the porch light was on. Bills were taken out, folded, and placed in Natalie's hand. She took them, quickly tucked them into her coat pocket, and led the guest inside. There was no more doubt after that, Howard said. No one hands over cash like that just to visit friends. When he said that, I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't need him to continue, but he did, because some truths need to be spoken to be undeniable. He said that from that moment on, he knew my house had been turned into something else. No longer a family home, but a place of transactions, a place of exchange, an illegal boarding house, operating in silence. I opened my eyes. I wasn't as shocked as I expected. There was no spinning, no collapse. Instead, there was a strange stillness, as if part of me had known this answer for a long time and simply hadn't dared to name it. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "Thank you for telling me." Howard shook his head. "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner." I looked at him and saw not curiosity or judgment in his eyes, but the guilt of a good neighbor. I knew he owed me nothing. I, too, had chosen silence for too long. When Howard said the words, "illegal boarding house," it didn't surprise me. It only completed the picture. The sleepless nights, the suitcases, the cash, the locked room, everything fit together in a terrifying way. I thought of Harold's room, of his belongings being touched and used by strangers who didn't know who they belonged to. A sharp pain pierced my chest, but it didn't break me. It sharpened me. I told Howard I wasn't surprised. He looked at me, slightly startled. I gave a sad smile. "I felt it for a long time," I said. "I just didn't want to believe it." We sat there in the small living room, listening to the night. No one spoke for a while, but in my mind another thought, heavier than the rest, began to take shape. If they dared to turn my home into an illegal rental, if they dared to take cash from strangers under my roof, then what else was happening that I hadn't seen yet? I had seen enough to know this wasn't something small, but deep down I also knew that the nights of renting out rooms were only the surface. There was something behind those stacks of papers I saw in the shed, something tied to the urgency, to the way Natalie controlled everything, to the way Ethan avoided my eyes. I looked at my house again through the window. It stood there, silent, like a mute witness to everything happening inside. I wasn't shocked to learn it had been turned into an illegal boarding house. I had prepared myself for that truth, even if I didn't want it. But I also understood something that weighed even heavier on my heart. When people are willing to do something that wrong, they rarely stop there. I knew, very clearly, that something worse was waiting ahead. And I also knew that from this moment on, I had no choice but to face it, even if the cost might be everything I had ever trusted. The next morning, when the sunlight just brushed the edge of the kitchen windowsill, I knew it was time to take another step, not a step back, a step into a different role. I sat at the dining table, my hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, trying to keep my voice as normal as possible when I said the sentence I had prepared all night. "I think I'll go visit my sister for a week." The words dropped into the quiet space like a small stone tossed into a still lake. Ethan looked up first. Natalie stopped folding towels. In a very brief moment, so brief that if I hadn't been watching them closely, I would have missed it, I saw something flicker. Not worry, not surprise, but relief, almost happiness. "Really, Mom?" Natalie asked, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Is she doing well?" I nodded. "She is. She's called a few times already, saying it's been too long since we last saw each other. Ethan set his coffee cup down and smiled at me. You should go. A change of scenery would be good. Staying home all the time gets boring. Boring. The words sounded so light, as if this house were no longer a place that belonged to me. I watched them more closely as we talked. Natalie asked how many days I would be gone, how I was traveling, whether she should prepare food in advance. Ethan nodded repeatedly, occasionally adding things like, "You deserve a rest," or, "We'll take care of the house." Every word was polite, perfectly appropriate. But that very perfection made my skin crawl. There was no hesitation, no questions like, "Are you okay traveling alone?" or "Should I go with you?" They wanted me to go, and they didn't hide it well enough. That afternoon, I took my old suitcase out of the closet. The brown one worn at the corners, the one Harold and I used for long trips. I placed it in the middle of the living room, opened it, and began packing. I did it slowly, deliberately. I wanted them to see. I wanted every shirt, every pair of socks placed inside the suitcase to say clearly, I am about to leave. Natalie walked past a few times, always wearing that gentle smile. "Don't pack too much, Mom. It's just a week." She spoke like a caring daughter-in-law. Ethan brought me a jacket, saying the evenings at my sister's place might be colder. I took it, thanked him, and kept packing. Inside, something ached. Not because they were helping me, but because they were helping too quickly, too eagerly, as if they were politely pushing me toward the door. That evening, I picked up my phone and called my sister. In truth, I called the voicemail of an old number I knew no one answered anymore. I spoke loudly enough for them to hear. I laughed, asked how she was doing, said I would be leaving in the morning, said I missed her. I even pretended to debate which jacket I should bring. Natalie stood in the kitchen, Ethan in the living room. They listened, and I knew that in their minds, everything was going exactly according to plan. The next morning, Ethan offered to drive me to the bus station. "I'll take you. It's easier that way," he said, sounding relieved. I nodded, pretended to hesitate for a moment, then agreed. Natalie helped carry my suitcase to the car. She hugged me, patted my back, and said, "Have a safe trip." That hug had no warmth. It felt like a ritual. On the way to the station, Ethan talked about small things, work, the weather, traffic. I watched my son through the rearview mirror. He focused on driving, occasionally glancing at me. There was nothing that looked like concern from a son seeing his mother off. Only carefully hidden impatience. At the station, Ethan parked and took my suitcase out for me. He stood there and hugged me again. "Call me when you arrive," he said. I looked into his eyes. For a brief second, I wondered if he felt any guilt. Then he turned away, as if he couldn't stand my gaze for too long. "Of course," I said. I walked into the station, pulling my suitcase behind me. I passed the ticket gate. I didn't look back. I knew that if I did, I would see Ethan standing there, waiting for me to board, not out of worry, but to make sure I truly left. I sat on a bench, watching the bus prepare to depart. Once Ethan had been gone long enough, I stood up, pulled my suitcase toward the back exit of the station. I didn't get on the bus. I went outside, flagged down a small taxi, and gave the address I had known by heart for many years, Howard's house. When the taxi stopped at the gate, Howard was already waiting. He looked at me with an expression that held both concern and resolve. I pulled my suitcase inside, closed the door, and in that moment I felt as though I had crossed a line I could never return from. I was no longer a passive mother waiting to see what her children would do next. I had chosen to stand on the other side, the side of the truth. From the upstairs room in Howard's house, I could clearly see the front door of my own home. I set the suitcase down without opening it. I didn't need my belongings. I needed my eyes and my memory. That evening, as night fell, I saw Natalie open the door. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. Strangers arrived. Luggage went inside. Money changed hands. Everything happened faster, more naturally than on previous nights, as if they were certain I was truly gone. Their caution disappeared, replaced by the ease of people who believed no one was watching. I stood there, memorizing every detail, the timing, the number of people, the type of luggage, the way Natalie held the money, the way Ethan appeared afterward, calm, as if he had just come home from a normal work day. I didn't write anything down. I stored it in my mind. I knew my memory was still very good, better than they thought. The second night, the third night, I stayed there. I became a witness to my own home. Each night I saw another piece of the picture, and each piece made me more certain that what they were doing wasn't just about money. In that silence, I began preparing my counterattack, not with rage, not with a sudden confrontation, but with cold patience. I needed to understand the entire play before pulling back the curtain. I needed to know how far they had gone and how much farther they planned to go. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't tired. There is a kind of clarity that appears only when you know you are standing at a major turning point. I felt it clearly with every breath. I had left the house, in name only. In reality, I was coming back stronger than ever. On the third night after I had left town, I began to see the entire picture that had previously appeared only in fragments. My house was no longer operating like a family home. It had shifted into a different rhythm, cold and precise, like a machine that had been carefully oiled. Couples arrived so regularly that I could predict it. Usually after 7 p.m., when the sky began to darken and the surrounding houses turned on their lights, the first car appeared. Some nights it was a black SUV, other nights a silver sedan, sometimes a rental car with company stickers still on it. No one stayed more than one night. No one came back a second time. But the common thread never changed. They always brought luggage, and they always arrived with the cautious air of people who didn't want to be recognized. Natalie greeted them like someone completely accustomed to it. She didn't need to check her phone or look at the clock. She knew exactly when they would arrive. The door opened before the bell rang. I saw her smile, not a polite smile, but the smile of someone in control. She tilted her head, said a few brief words, then held out her hand. Cash was placed into her palm. No receipts, no questions, just smooth, unspoken understanding. I had never imagined Natalie could do this so skillfully. She led the guests inside, guided them up the stairs, opened the door to the room I had once called the safest place of my life. I saw the light turn on inside, spilling through the window exactly as I remembered. But now it illuminated unfamiliar faces. They set their suitcases down on the floor, sat on the bed where I had once lain beside Harold, where I had held his hand through long nights of illness. Ethan appeared later. He was never there when the money was exchanged. He always came home like a normal husband, a normal son, taking off his jacket, hanging it up, stepping into the kitchen. But then he did small things, very small things, that made his role clear. He carried extra towels upstairs. He checked the water heater. He reminded Natalie to lock the back door. Everything happened quietly, in sync, without a word needing to be explained. One night, I saw Ethan standing in the upstairs hallway speaking to a pair of guests. He smiled, nodded, pointed toward the bathroom. That gesture made my chest tighten. That was my son, playing the role of a hotel employee in the house I had spent my entire life building. I began to count, not because I cared about the money, but because I needed to understand the scale of this betrayal. For each couple, I saw Natalie take about $50 to $60. Some nights there was one couple, some nights two. On weekends, more. 3, even 4 groups. I calculated silently, number by number, the way one counts heartbeats when they know something is wrong. In a single weekend night, they could make more than $200. In a week, close to $1,000. In a month, the number jumped to a level I didn't want to think about. Thousands of dollars. Money, earned by using my house, my utilities, and worse, by violating my most sacred memories. Every time the bedroom light came on, I thought of Harold. I remembered the way he used to place a book on his chest when he dozed off. I remembered the steady sound of his breathing in the quiet night. And now, those sounds were replaced. Suitcase wheels, hushed voices, doors closing. It felt like someone was walking muddy shoes across a carpet I had spent my life protecting. The pain didn't come all at once. It accumulated. It settled in layers like dust on furniture. And then, without my noticing when it happened, that pain transformed into anger. Not loud anger, but cold anger. The kind that made my hands shake as I gripped the window railing. The kind that forced me to bite my lip to keep from bursting out of Howard's house, crossing the street, and pounding on my own front door. There were moments when I stood up abruptly. I turned, ready to go down the stairs. In my mind, I saw myself standing in the living room, looking straight at Natalie and Ethan, asking a single question. "What do you think you're doing in my house?" I imagined their faces when exposed, the panic, the confusion, maybe even pleading. Then Howard placed his hand on my arm. "Don't," he said quietly, but firmly. I turned to him, my eyes burning with anger. "They're humiliating me in my own home," I whispered. "I can't just stand by and watch." Howard shook his head slowly. "I know, but you have to look carefully. If you confront them now, they'll deny it. They'll say it's just a few friends. They'll twist the story until you're the one who seems overly sensitive. And if they're doing this, there's a good chance they're doing something else too." That last sentence stopped me cold. I looked back at the house. Natalie stood in the kitchen, laughing with a newly arrived couple. Ethan carried extra blankets upstairs. Everything ran smoothly, like a system that had been operating for a long time. Howard was right. This wasn't the moment to explode. This was the moment to observe, to remember, to accumulate. I needed to know how far they had gone. I needed to know whether what I was seeing was the bottom or just the surface of something darker. I sat back down and took a deep breath. The anger was still there, burning in my chest, but I forced it to settle, turning it into something else, sharp focus. I told myself every night they hosted guests was a night they left traces. Every dollar they took was evidence, and every memory violated was a reason I could not afford to soften. My house had been turned into a secret hotel, but I hadn't lost it. Not yet. I was still here. I could still see, and I could still remember. I thought I had already seen the worst. I believed that turning my home into a secret hotel, making money from rooms filled with memories, was the lowest point of betrayal. But I was wrong. Some truths don't reveal themselves on their own. They wait to be spoken at the right moment by someone brave enough to break the silence. Howard told me that story on a gray afternoon, with light rain falling on the porch outside. We sat in the kitchen, each holding a cup of tea that had gone cold without either of us noticing. I was still thinking about the night before, about the last pair of guests leaving my house near dawn, when Howard cleared his throat. There was something heavier than usual in the sound. "Lorraine," he said slowly, "there's something I haven't told you." I looked up. In his eyes, I saw the hesitation of someone who had kept something hidden for too long. My instinct, once again, began pounding in my chest. Howard said that about 2 weeks earlier, before things were as obvious as they were now, he'd been sitting at the small cafe near the post office. It was a place he went every Thursday morning, ordered a cup of black coffee, and read the newspaper. That day, he hadn't been paying much attention until he saw Natalie walk in. Natalie wasn't alone. She sat down across from a man Howard had never seen in town. The man looked to be around 50 years old, neatly dressed, wearing a dark jacket, his hair carefully combed. Most important of all, he carried a thick briefcase, the kind people don't bring just to have a casual coffee. Howard hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the cafe was small, and they weren't speaking very quietly. At first, he heard scattered words that didn't seem alarming. Paperwork, procedures, timing. Then he heard words that made him lower his newspaper. Legal capacity. Howard repeated the phrase to me slowly, as if he himself didn't want to believe what he had heard. I felt a chill run down my back. He said Natalie leaned toward the man, lowered her voice, and mentioned something about a mental evaluation. The man nodded, opened the briefcase, and pointed to several pages. Then Howard heard another phrase, one that nearly stopped my heart when he repeated it. Nursing home. I don't remember how I reacted in the seconds that followed. I only remember the cold spreading along my spine, as if someone had poured ice water over me. Those words weren't random. They don't appear in casual conversation. They are the language of law, of planning, of calculation. Howard said he sat there, heart racing, afraid to turn his head and look directly at them. He worried that if they realized he was paying attention, the conversation would stop. But he heard enough to know Natalie wasn't talking about anyone else. She was talking about me. She needs to be evaluated. Howard recalled Natalie's voice, calm, without emotion. Just to be sure. She's not young anymore. Howard didn't hear every detail, but he heard enough to know it wasn't an innocent conversation. When Natalie stood up, the man closed the briefcase, nodded, and they left the cafe, together. Howard sat there for a long time afterward, unable to take another sip of his coffee. I didn't know what to do, Howard said, his voice rough. I was afraid I'd heard wrong, and I was afraid if I said something without being sure, I'd scare you. I didn't blame him. Because if I had heard that story from someone else, I might have asked myself the same question. Was I imagining things? But now, with all the pieces laid side by side, the locked rooms, the papers I saw at night, the way they pushed me out of the house, everything became brutally clear. The house wasn't just a source of income, it was the target. And I was the obstacle. My throat went dry. Are you sure? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Howard nodded. I'm sure I can't forget those words. That very night, I called Rebecca. Rebecca is my lawyer and also an old friend from when I worked at the city library. Her voice on the other end of the line was as calm as ever, but when I told her what Howard had overheard, I sensed a very slight change in her breathing. Lorraine, Rebecca said after a brief silence, if they're discussing legal capacity and a mental evaluation, this is more serious than you think. She explained it to me, without rushing, without trying to scare me, but every word felt like a knife cutting through my last remaining illusion. At my age, all it takes is one unfavorable medical evaluation, even one that's manipulated or misinterpreted, and a court can consider appointing a legal guardian. And if that guardian is Ethan, your assets, Rebecca said plainly, could be legally controlled. The house, the bank accounts, medical decisions, everything. I gripped the phone tightly. But I'm completely clear-minded, I said, my voice shaking. I'm not incompetent. I know, Rebecca replied, and that's exactly why you have to act early. Because if they move first, if they build a file, prepare paperwork, create evidence, then you'll be the one who has to prove you're competent instead of them having to prove you're not. That sentence made the full danger crystal clear. This wasn't a sneaky money-making scheme anymore. This was a reversal of power. Once the legal wheels start turning, they don't stop easily. Natalie is very smart, Rebecca continued. And if she's working with someone who understands the law, someone carrying a briefcase, then they're not thinking about just a few $1,000s in room rentals. I sat silently, listening to the rain hit the window. In my mind, the image of Natalie taking cash from guests suddenly seemed small, almost trivial. That was only the first step, a way to generate money, a way to prove they were managing the house effectively, a way to prepare for something much bigger. They want my life, I said quietly, almost to myself. Rebecca didn't deny it. Yes, she said. They want control of everything, legally. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. There was only a deep stillness like a frozen lake. I thought of Ethan, the son I had raised, trusted completely. I thought of Natalie, the woman who had entered my family with a gentle smile. And I realized the most painful part wasn't that they wanted money. It wasn't that they were violating my home. The most painful part was that they had planned to erase me from my own life through legal, cold, methodical means, without leaving any visible trace of cruelty on the surface. I stood up and walked to the window, looking toward my house. The lights were still on. Normal life was still going on inside, but I knew that from this moment on I couldn't hesitate anymore. Because once people start talking about legal capacity and nursing homes, it's no longer a family matter. It's a fight for the right to exist as yourself. I didn't sleep at all that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind was painfully clear. Rebecca's words echoed over and over, each sentence like a cold stone dropping onto an already frozen lake. If they moved first, if they prepared enough paperwork and enough evidence, I would be pushed into a position where I had to prove I was still myself. That thought made it impossible for me to sit still another day. The next morning, when Ethan left early for work and Natalie drove out to go shopping, Howard looked at me and, with just a nod, understood what I was about to do. I didn't say it out loud, but we both knew it was time for me to face the place they believed I would never dare to touch, the shed behind the yard, the place where Harold had spent the last decades of his life fixing small things, building bookshelves for me, and storing tools he could never bring himself to throw away. I walked across the grass, still wet with dew, my heart beating hard but steady. The shed key was still on my old key ring. At least that gave me a small sense that they hadn't managed to replace everything yet. The door opened with its familiar creak. The smell of old wood and machine oil filled my nose, carrying a warmth of memory I didn't have time to indulge. Dim light filtered through the small window, just enough for me to see the old wooden shelves, Harold's workbench, and something that did not belong there at all. A gray metal safe, placed neatly under the table. I froze for a few seconds. My heart pounded harder, Not from surprise, but from the cold confirmation of suspicions that had clung to me for weeks. I stepped closer and bent down. The safe wasn't locked. Maybe they were in a hurry, or maybe they were too confident that no one else would come in here. I opened the safe. Inside was cash, more than I expected. Bundles of bills neatly tied with rubber bands in various denominations. I didn't count carefully, but a single glance was enough to know it represented many nights, many weeks, money earned from my house, my room, my memories. Nausea rose in my throat, but I forced myself to keep going. Beneath the cash was a thick stack of documents. I took them out and placed them on Harold's workbench, where he used to set his coffee cup every morning. The first folder made my hands tremble, a short-term rental contract. The address was my house. The owner was clearly listed, Ethan. My son's name sat boldly on the line marked owner, like a knife driven straight into the last trust I was still trying to hold on to. I turned the next page. In the notes section, there was a small line of text that made it hard to breathe. Ownership transfer in progress. Pending court ruling. Transfer. Pending ruling. I set that stack down, took a deep breath, and continued. There was another file clipped separately with a light-colored cover. On it were words that made my blood run cold. Capacity evaluation. My name was printed clearly. My age. A scheduled evaluation date. The assessment section. Blank. But at the bottom of the page, there was already a doctor's signature, a doctor I had never met. That signature sat there like a forged certainty waiting to be legalized. I flipped the page. Another sheet slid out, a price quote from a place with a very gentle-sounding name, Evergreen Haven, a nursing home, private room, full-time care. The cost was printed boldly at the bottom, a number so high I had to look twice to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Everything had been calculated. They had chosen where to confine me, priced out the rest of my life the way one selects an item from a catalog. My legs felt weak, but I didn't allow myself to sit down. I knew I had to keep going while I still could. At the bottom of the stack was another document, a full power of attorney. My name was already printed under grantor, Ethan's name under agent. Only one thing was missing, my signature. The line was blank, glaringly white. I could picture the moment they were planning, me signing it while not fully aware, then waking up to realize I had handed everything over myself. A small piece of paper slipped out from between the pages. I picked it up, my hands shaking violently. It was a handwritten note, in Natalie's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The lines were short, clinical, chilling. It mentioned a sedative, dosage, timing, before the evaluation. No further explanation was needed. Everything was painfully clear. I stood there for a long time, listening to my heart pounding in my chest, as if it were reminding me that I was still alive, that I still had the right to decide. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. For a moment, I wanted to burn everything, to erase every trace of this plot, but I knew that wasn't my path. I took out my phone, every document, every page, every line. I photographed them all. I made sure the lighting was clear, the signatures sharp. I photographed the safe and the cash inside it. I didn't miss a single detail. Each click of the camera felt like reclaiming a piece of control that had been stolen from me. When I put everything back in place, closed the safe, and shut the shed door, I stood still for a moment longer. A light breeze moved through the yard. The house ahead looked as peaceful as ever. But I knew that from this moment on, there was no room left for hesitation. I had seen everything. I had touched the evidence. And I understood with absolute clarity there was only one path forward, not the path of an impulsive confrontation, not of pleading or hoping for a late awakening. It was the path of truth, revealed at the right moment, in the right way, to protect me from the very people who had planned to erase me from my own life. I left the shed with a strange calm, not because I was no longer afraid, but because fear had transformed into something else, cold clarity. Once you face the evidence head on, there are few choices left: collapse or stand up and move forward. I chose the second. That same afternoon, I called Rebecca. It wasn't a panicked call. I spoke slowly, clearly, straight to the point. I told her I had found everything: the cash safe, the contracts, the mental evaluation files, the unsigned power of attorney, the note about sedatives. On the other end of the line, Rebecca was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was no longer gentle as usual. It was sharp and steady, the voice of someone who had seen enough to know exactly what needed to be done. "Lorraine," she said, "we act now, not one more minute of waiting." That evening, Rebecca arranged for me to see an independent doctor, someone with no ties, no connections to my family. The appointment was discreet but serious. I answered every question, completed every test, not to prove I was normal, but to create a record that could not be twisted. When the doctor signed the certificate confirming my legal capacity, I felt as if I had reclaimed a piece of territory that had been silently occupied. Rebecca didn't stop there. She immediately drafted revocation documents, revoking any and all powers of attorney, present or future. Any document that might have been signed before, if any existed, was rendered invalid. Everything was notarized, stamped, and properly filed. I signed each page, my hand steady. Every signature redrew a boundary. Then came the will. Rebecca asked if I was sure. I nodded. No tears, no hesitation. We revised the will that very night. Everything was written clearly, transparently, leaving no room for vague interpretation. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it for safety, for truth. And because I had come to understand that once family becomes a tool, it is no longer family. When all the paperwork was finished, Rebecca leaned back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment. "Now," she said, "we plan the counterstrike, not to scare them, but to end this." The plan was simple, and that simplicity was exactly what made it effective. I would return home. I would play the role of a mother back from visiting her sister, tired but content. I would change nothing. No suspicion, no probing questions. I would let Ethan and Natalie continue believing everything was unfolding exactly as they had planned. "We don't drag them into the light yet," Rebecca said. "We let them walk into it themselves." I understood. When people believe they're about to win, they become careless. The next evening I went back home. I pulled my suitcase across the threshold, took a deep breath, and rang the doorbell. The door opened quickly. Natalie stood there, her smile flawless, her eyes lighting up in a way I had once mistaken for joy. Now I knew. It was relief. "You're back," she said sweetly. "How was the trip?" "Good," I replied, smiling just enough. "She's the same as ever, loud but warm." Ethan appeared behind Natalie, looked at me, and nodded. He took my suitcase and placed it neatly in the corner. There were no probing questions, no scrutiny. They trusted me, trusted that I was still the woman they believed they could guide. In the days that followed, I lived exactly as before. I woke early, made coffee, read the paper. I asked Natalie if she needed anything from the store. I smiled when Ethan talked about work. I didn't mention the locked room. I didn't bring up the shed. I even appeared a bit more tired, as if the trip had drained me. Everything flowed so smoothly that sometimes I had to remind myself this was a performance, and they didn't suspect a thing. On the contrary, they seemed more confident. I noticed it in the brief whispers they no longer bothered to hide as carefully. In the way Natalie proactively asked if I wanted to schedule a routine health checkup. In the way Ethan talked about arranging things so Mom wouldn't have to worry so much. Those words in another context might have sounded like care, but I knew exactly what they were. They continued their plan. I knew the date and time, not because they said it outright, but because of the pieces I already had, the appointment schedule in the files, the note about sedatives, the half-veiled comments. I knew the evaluation would happen on a weekday morning. I knew they would choose a time when I was usually most groggy. I knew they had already prepared the script, from taking me there to explaining everything to outsiders, and I let them believe they were about to win. I let Natalie make me tea every evening. I let Ethan remind me to go to bed early. I even pretended to forget small things. My keys, my reading glasses, just enough to reinforce the image they were trying to build. Not too much, just enough. Meanwhile, everything Rebecca had prepared was quietly waiting for the right moment. Documents had been filed, records sealed. The people who needed to know knew. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to run. I just needed to stand still and let the truth do its work. Some nights I lay in my old bedroom, staring at the ceiling, thinking of Harold. I wondered what he would say if he could see me now. He probably wouldn't say much. He would just place his hand over mine the way he used to and tell me I was doing the right thing. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not because the danger had disappeared, but because I had stopped avoiding it. Ethan and Natalie believed they were very close to the finish line. They believed everything was within their grasp. I let them believe that, because some traps only work when the prey walks in wearing a victorious smile. That night came sooner than I expected. Not because time moved quickly, but because everything had already been set in place, waiting only for the final moment to collapse. As darkness settled, the porch lights turned on as they did every evening. I sat in my room with the door slightly ajar, clearly hearing the familiar rhythm of life downstairs. Natalie moved around the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes touching. Ethan went up and down the stairs, checking locks, checking light switches. They didn't realize that this very professionalism had become the most vivid evidence against them. There were more guests than usual. I recognized it immediately from the first sounds. Not just one couple, then a second, then a group of 3. The sound of suitcases rolling across the tiled porch came one after another, each time making my heartbeat slow by one beat, not from fear, but because I knew I was nearing the end. Natalie greeted them as always, her voice just friendly enough, just discreet enough. I heard soft laughter, brief greetings. Money changed hands. I didn't see it, but I didn't need to anymore. I had seen it too many times. The house was full of guests. I closed my eyes for a brief moment. This was exactly the moment Rebecca had talked about, the moment they felt most confident, the moment they believed no one was watching them anymore. And then the doorbell rang. Not the familiar chime, not the short, cautious press of a renter. This sound was firmer, longer, as if the person outside wasn't asking for permission. Natalie froze. I could clearly hear her footsteps stop in the middle of the living room. Ethan came down the stairs faster than usual. I heard his voice call out, trying to stay calm. "Yes." "Who is it?" A man's voice answered from outside, low and clear. "City Inspector, please open the door for a lodging inspection." Just one sentence, but it was enough to freeze the air inside the house. I stood up, not rushed, not shaking. I adjusted the light jacket on my shoulders and took a deep breath. I didn't step out right away. I let them open the door. I let them face the truth before I appeared. The door opened. I heard shoes stepping inside. Not just one person, at least two. The inspector's voice sounded steady and professional, without emotion. "We've received reports of illegal short-term lodging activity at this address." Natalie smiled, a smile I knew all too well, but this time it didn't quite hold together. "There must be a mistake," she said. "This is a private residence." The inspector didn't argue. He simply turned to a younger man and gestured. The man pulled out a camera. "May I ask," the inspector continued, "who are the people present here tonight?" The air went silent for a few seconds. Then a stranger's voice spoke up, a middle-aged man standing near the sofa. "I rented a room here. I paid by the night." Natalie spun toward him. "You—" But it was already too late. Another woman spoke, sounding confused. "We were referred here. We paid cash when we arrived." Sentence by sentence, like bricks falling from the fake wall Natalie and Ethan had built. None of the guests knew they were becoming witnesses, but the truth doesn't need staging. It only needs the right questions. The inspector nodded and took notes. Then he turned to Ethan. "Are you the homeowner?" Ethan opened his mouth. No sound came out for the first second. Natalie stepped forward, trying to regain control. "They're just friends staying over. There's no business going on." The inspector looked straight at her. "Then please explain why multiple unrelated individuals are here with luggage and have confirmed paying for lodging." No one could answer. "We need to inspect the rooms." The inspector said it like a formality, but I knew, and they knew, it was the end. Doors were opened, one room at a time. My old bedroom, the bed not yet made, a suitcase at the foot of the bed, guests' personal items scattered in the bathroom, the next room, two people. One of them ended a phone call abruptly. The last room down the hall, sheets still damp. The camera clicked repeatedly. Pens scratched on paper. There was nothing left to deny, and that was when I stepped out. I walked down the stairs slowly. Each step was a year of my life in this house. I entered the living room, where all eyes immediately turned to me. I stood straight. "Hello," I said calmly. "I am the legal owner of this house." The inspector turned to me immediately. "You confirm that you did not authorize any rental activity here." "I have never authorized it," I replied, "and I only just learned about this." Natalie went pale. Ethan turned toward me, eyes wide, as if seeing me for the first time in his life. "Mom," he whispered. I didn't look at him. I looked at the inspector. "I am prepared to provide all documents proving ownership." The inspector nodded. He didn't need any further explanation. The report was written on the spot. Illegal lodging operation, cash payments, no registration, no permit, multiple violations at once. The guests were instructed to leave within 30 minutes. Some were angry, some confused. Some silently pulled their suitcases out of my house, fading into the night like shadows. I stood still, watching each person cross the threshold, people who had never belonged there. When the door closed for the last time, the living room felt painfully empty. The inspector handed Ethan and Natalie the citation. The number printed on it made Natalie grab the back of a chair. "You will receive further summonses for follow-up proceedings," he said. The door closed behind them. Silence, no guests, No roles to play, no place to hide. Natalie turned toward me, her voice breaking. "Mom, I can explain. I think tonight is enough," I said gently but firmly. "The game is over." Ethan collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Natalie stood frozen like an actor who had forgotten the final line. My house was quiet again, but not the way it used to be, because the truth had been spoken, publicly, in front of everyone. And from that moment on, no one in this house could pretend it had never happened. The door closed behind the inspectors, leaving a silence so heavy I could hear the second hand ticking on the wall clock. Ethan still sat there, head bowed, shoulders slumped as if he had aged 10 years overnight. Natalie stood by the dining table, hands clenched together, lips pale, eyes with nowhere left to hide. I was the one who broke the silence. "Ethan," I said my son's name slowly, without raising my voice. "Look up at me." He lifted his head. In his eyes there was no more calculation, no more confidence of someone who thought he was in control. Only the panic of a child caught doing something unforgivable. "How far were you going to take this?" I asked. "Turning my house into an illegal hotel, preparing paperwork to declare me legally incompetent. And then what? Putting me in a nursing home so you could finish signing everything else?" Ethan trembled. "Mom, I didn't mean—" "You did," I cut him off, my voice strangely calm. "You did, because everything was prepared. The capacity evaluation files, the full power of attorney, even notes about sedatives." Natalie broke down sobbing. "I just wanted things to be easier," she said, her voice shattered. "She's old. She can't manage anymore. We were just—" "Stop," I said, turning to look at her for the first time that night. There was no rage in my eyes, only deep exhaustion. "You have no right to decide my life, and you certainly have no right to drug me to get my signature." Natalie collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Ethan began to cry out loud, not the kind of crying that begs for mercy, but the sound of someone realizing they've crossed a line they can never undo. I looked at my son for a long time. I remembered holding him as a baby, his first steps in this very living room, the nights I waited up for him when he studied far from home. That love didn't disappear, but it was damaged, permanently. "You will leave this house," I said, "within this week." Natalie looked up, horrified. "Mom, there is no mom right now," I replied. "This house is no longer safe with the two of you in it." Ethan nodded, not arguing. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he understood he had no right to demand anything. I continued, slowly and clearly. "I will not press criminal charges against you, not because I've forgotten what you did, but because I don't want the rest of my life tied to courtrooms and resentment." Ethan collapsed, sobbing. Natalie said nothing more. I didn't comfort them. I didn't insult them either. Some lessons don't need further explanation. A week later, the house was empty again. I changed the locks. I threw open the rooms that had once been locked. I took out Harold's belongings, cleaned them, arranged them, put them back where they belonged. I repainted the bedroom walls, changed the sheets, opened the windows to let the sunlight in. Slowly, the house began to breathe again, with my breath in it. I didn't live alone in bitterness. I lived more slowly. I replanted the small garden out back. I drank coffee on the porch every morning. I smiled at Howard when he came by, and for the first time in a long while, I slept peacefully without listening for strange noises in the night. Forgiveness didn't come immediately. It wasn't a decision made in one evening. It was a process. I learned to forgive, not to erase what happened, but to keep it from defining the rest of my life. I came to understand a simple but painful truth. Blind love is not love. It's a trap. And sometimes, to protect herself, a mother must learn to draw boundaries, even with her own child. I still love Ethan, but I no longer hand my life over to anyone. And if you've stayed with me to the end, I want to say thank you. Thank you for listening to the story of an older woman who learned to stand up late, but not too late. If you were me, what would you do if your own child tried to take your life away from you? Where are you watching this story from? Leave me a comment. I truly want to hear from you. If this story touched you, please like and subscribe so we can meet again in the stories to come. I'm grateful to you for your time, your empathy, and for bringing your heart here with me until the very end.